On a Tuesday afternoon in November of 1964, in a narrow street behind the intersection of Grant Avenue and Sacramento Street in San Francisco's Chinatown district, there were 11 people present. 4 of them were students. 3 of them were shopkeepers who had stepped out of their doorways to watch. 2 of them were delivery men who had set down their crates without being asked. 1 of them was a fighter who had driven 90 miles from Los Angeles that morning with a specific purpose in mind. And 1 of them was a 33-year-old man in a gray cardigan and reading glasses who had been pricing used paperbacks since 7 in the morning and had not yet eaten lunch. The fighter was 26 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall and weighed 219 pounds in his street clothes. He had competed in 41 amateur bouts in Northern California and Nevada and had lost 3 of them, all on points, none on damage. He had a shelf of trophies in his apartment in Oakland that his girlfriend had asked him twice to move to the garage. He had studied Shotokan karate for 9 years under a man who had himself studied under a man who had trained in Osaka before the war. His technique was not decorative, it was functional, and it had been tested, and it had held. He had come to the bookshop because of a name. In the next 11 seconds, the distance between those 2 men would change in a way that none of the 11 people present would be able to describe accurately an hour later, because it happened at a speed that the human eye processes, but the human memory cannot reconstruct without revision. What remained in each of their accounts, even 40 years on, was not the motion itself. It was the sound, the specific sound of a man discovering the difference between what he believed and what was true. Nobody on that street understood yet what they were about to see. Nobody in that district, in that city, in that country had any framework for what was about to be demonstrated. The man in the gray cardigan had no title that any of them knew. He had no belt displayed in any window. There was no plaque beside the door with his name on it. He was, as far as the street was concerned, a man who sold second-hand books and kept the shop neat and opened it promptly at 7 and occasionally corrected the pronunciation of a Chinese phrase when a customer attempted one in his presence. He was 33 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed 138 pounds that morning and had not yet eaten, which made him perhaps 136. He was Bruce Lee. And the man across from him did not know that yet. If you want to find out what happened in those 11 seconds, and what was said afterward, and why the fighter who drove 90 miles that morning would tell the story for the rest of his life, not as a defeat, but as the most important education he ever received, stay with this until the end. What happened in that alley behind Grant Avenue would take years to reach the people who needed to hear it, and by the time it did, certain details had changed. But the core of it remained. The core of it always remained. The bookshop had been on the street for 6 years. It was called Winding Road Books, which was a translation its owner had chosen deliberately from a Chinese phrase that meant something closer to a path that teaches by resisting you. The owner had painted the sign himself, in English on one side and in traditional characters on the other. The shop was narrow and deep, the kind of place where 2 customers browsing in the same aisle had to negotiate passage with small sideways steps. The shelves were floor to ceiling. The categorization system was personal and logical and visible only to the man who maintained it. He had been in San Francisco for 3 years at that point. Before San Francisco, there had been Hong Kong, and before Hong Kong, there had been Seattle, where he had opened a school on Capitol Hill and taught a small group of students a method of fighting that he was still refining, that was still being born inside him, that had no fixed name yet and would not until later. He had come to San Francisco partly for the city, and partly because of the community, and partly because of a conversation with a man who told him that the Chinatown district had a particular density of martial artists, of a particular kind of seriousness, the kind who would challenge rather than merely observe. That had appealed to him. He had opened the bookshop because he needed the income while the school grew, and because he read with an appetite that his students found unusual. On the shelves behind the counter, organized in a system that only he navigated with ease, there were texts on physiology and geometry and psychology and military theory and boxing and wrestling and animal locomotion. There was a copy of Hemingway and a copy of Miyamoto Musashi and a copy of a German text on the physics of impact that he had translated relevant passages from himself into a notebook he kept under the counter. He was in the middle of pricing a box of donated paperbacks when the bell above the door announced a customer. The man who entered was not a customer. He was wearing a white training jacket over street clothes, and his hands, when he rested them on the counter, were calloused at the third and fourth knuckle in a specific pattern that indicated years of board-breaking practice, the kind that develops the striking surface deliberately and at cost. He introduced himself with a name and a school and a rank, and then he said something that the watching students, positioned by the shelves with the pretense of browsing, would each remember slightly differently afterward. What all four of them agreed on was the substance. He said that he had heard there was a man in this district who taught fighting, and that he had come to assess the quality of that teaching, because in his view, what was being spread in these schools was not fighting, but performance. And that performance had no place in a serious martial tradition, and that the man in question owed it to his students to acknowledge this before they spent any more of their time and money on it. He said some version of this for approximately 90 seconds. His voice was level and his posture was composed, and he was clearly not angry in any impulsive way. He had thought about what he was going to say before he said it. He had perhaps practiced it in the car on the 90-mile drive north that morning. When he finished, the man behind the counter set down the paperback he had been holding and removed his reading glasses and placed them on top of the cardboard box with a care that was unhurried. Then he looked at the man across the counter with an expression that the students present would later struggle to name. It was not anger. It was not amusement. It was something closer to recognition. He said, "Finish your thought." The man said he had. The man behind the counter nodded once. Then he said, to no one in particular but in a voice that carried to the back of the shop, "We will step outside." If you have found this channel, if this kind of story is what you look for on a Tuesday evening or a Saturday morning when the house is quiet, then subscribe now and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. There are more of these stories, and the next one will be ready before the week is out. The street behind the bookshop was 12 feet wide. It was bounded on one side by the rear wall of a restaurant and on the other by a wooden fence that separated it from a parking area. The surface was concrete, uneven near the fence line, where a root had worked its way up through a seam over the preceding decade. The light at that hour came from the west, low and flat, and it fell across the concrete at an angle that made the surface texture sharp and definite. 4 students filed out through the back door of the shop. The 2 delivery men, who had been at the far end of the street when the conversation inside began and had tracked its progression through the glass, moved their crates to the side and remained. 3 shopkeepers appeared in their doorways and did not move back inside. A total of 11 people. None of them spoke. The man in the white training jacket rolled his sleeves to the elbow. He had done this before in conditions like this, and his preparation was efficient and practiced. He moved to the center of the available space and settled into his stance, left side forward, weight even, hands at the correct height, the particular stillness of a man who has trained himself to manage adrenaline before it manages him. He was genuinely good. This is the fact that the witnesses all agreed on, both immediately and in retrospect. He was not posturing. He had not driven 90 miles to perform. What he carried in his body was real, and it had been acquired through years of genuine work and genuine discomfort and genuine contact. His reach at that stance was notable. His base was stable. His guard had no visible holes in it. A fight is not what most people believe it is. What most people imagine when they imagine a fight is two men exchanging techniques at a range that allows technique to be deployed and observed. What a real fight is, before it becomes anything else, is a question about distance. Who controls the space between two bodies controls everything that happens inside that space. The man who decides when the distance collapses is the man who decides the outcome. Everything that is not distance control is consequence. The man in the gray cardigan did not take a stance in any conventional sense. He stood. He was 8 feet from the man across from him, and he stood in a way that was not passive but not combative, not neutral but not declared. His hands were at his sides, and he was looking at the man opposite him with the same expression he had worn behind the counter, the expression the students had not been able to name. He is already lost. He just does not know it yet. Second one. The man in the white training jacket moved first. He feinted with the left hand, a controlled, intelligent feint designed not to land but to read a response, to locate the reflexes of the man opposite and establish a baseline. It was the correct opening against an unknown opponent. The delivery man to the left, the one who had set his crates nearest the fence, later said that this first movement happened and then something else happened, and he was not able to account for the interval between them. The feint landed in empty space. Not in the sense that the man in the gray cardigan flinched backward. Not in any retreating sense. The space where the cardigan had been was simply no longer occupied by the cardigan. Second two. The tournament director from the Chinatown Martial Arts Association, a man named Gerald Fong, who had overseen competitive events in this district for 11 years and who had watched thousands of exchanges in formal competition, was standing near the rear door of the restaurant. He would later say that he had seen the footwork, but not in any way that allowed him to describe it, that it appeared to him less like movement and more like a reclassification of where the man had been standing a moment before. The gap between them had closed from 8 feet to approximately 3 feet. The man in the white training jacket threw the right hand. This was the committed strike, the one that followed the feint at the moment when a response to the feint would have left an opening. It was timed correctly, and it was thrown with his mass behind it, and the angle of it was good. In 41 bouts, it had ended 22 of them in some decisive fashion. It did not land. The man in the gray cardigan moved inside it. Not away from it. Inside it, toward the shoulder that had launched it, into the space where the strike had already been, and where the body behind the strike had consequently arrived. The distance had collapsed not by retreat, but by entry. Second three. One of the students, a young woman named Patricia Sung, who was in her second month of training and who would later become one of the more thoughtful writers on the subject of this period, said afterward that she had at this moment become aware that the two men were now much closer together than they had been, and that the man in the white training jacket appeared to be aware of this also but appeared not to have arranged it. Second four. The right hand of the man in the gray cardigan was placed against the left forearm of the man in the white training jacket, not striking it, not gripping it. Placed against it, with a contact so light that the delivery man nearest the fence would later say it appeared to him like the gesture of a man steadying a glass. But the effect of this placement was that the man in the white training jacket could not locate his own arm with any confidence. The proprioceptive information his nervous system was receiving from that arm was no longer reliable. He threw the left elbow. This was not a trained technique in any classical sense. It was the correct instinctive response of a man whose right side has been compromised and who has enough experience to know that the elbow is available and carries enough force at close range to change a situation. It did not change the situation. Second 5. The elbow passed through space that the gray cardigan had already vacated. A delivery man, the second one, the one who had not moved since the action began, said that he noticed at this moment that the man in the white training jacket was breathing differently than he had been 11 seconds ago. That there was something in the breathing that was new and that had not been present when the man first walked out onto the street. The man in the gray cardigan was now standing 30 inches from the man in the white training jacket, and his position relative to him was such that the man in the white training jacket's trained responses, his catalog of techniques, the 9 years of drilling that lived in his nervous system and that had served him in 41 bouts, required a geometry that was no longer available to him. The distance he needed in order to use what he knew was not there. It had been taken from him, quietly, without his participation in the taking. Second 6. The right hand of the man in the gray cardigan rose. It rose to a height and angle that corresponded to the left temple of the man in the white training jacket, and it traveled toward that temple at a speed that Gerald Fong, who was the most qualified observer present, later said was among the fastest single movements he had seen in 3 decades of formal observation. It stopped. 1 inch from the temple. 2.5 inches of clearance between the knuckle and the bone. The man in the gray cardigan held it there, perfectly still. The duration of this stillness was not long. 1 second. Perhaps 2. The man in the white training jacket did not move during this stillness. His hands were at his sides. The hand was lowered, not thrown, not retracted with triumph. Lowered, as a man lowers a tool he no longer needs, deliberately and without drama. Gerald Fong set both hands flat on the surface of the crate nearest him. The 2 delivery men looked at each other and did not speak. Patricia Sung said that she became aware that she had been holding her breath and that she was not sure when she had begun doing so. The man in the gray cardigan extended his right hand, open, palm up, at approximately waist height. The street was quiet in the way that streets are quiet after something has happened that the air itself is still processing. The man in the white training jacket looked at the extended hand. He looked at it for a duration that the witnesses all estimated differently, between 4 and 12 seconds, depending on who was remembering. This was the moment. This was the door. Through it was one thing or another, and whichever he chose he would carry with him, and both choices were visible to the 11 people standing on that 12-foot street in the flat November light. He reached out and took the hand. He held it, and then he said something. He said it quietly, at a volume that did not reach the witnesses at the edges of the space. 2 people would later claim to have heard fragments. Patricia Sung, who was the closest, said she heard the word mistaken. Gerald Fong said he heard something that sounded like I did not understand what I was walking into. The delivery man near the fence said he heard nothing at all, but that the expression on the man's face was sufficient. The man in the gray cardigan did not speak in response. He nodded once, the same single nod he had produced behind the counter, and then he released the hand and turned and walked back through the rear door of his shop. The man in the white training jacket stood in the street for a moment. Then he picked up the jacket he had removed and folded it over one arm and walked to his car. He drove back to Oakland. He did not return to the bookshop. He did not seek another meeting. But he went back to his school the following morning and he began changing what he taught, not abandoning it but interrogating it, asking questions of it that he had not thought to ask before. Questions about the space between fighters and who governs it and why. He removed 3 techniques from his core curriculum that fall because when he held them against what he had experienced in the alley behind Grant Avenue, they did not survive the comparison. He never discussed the encounter publicly in specific terms. But he told two of his senior students about it, in a general way, without naming names, in the context of a lesson about the danger of certainty. One of those students told another student. That student moved to Portland in 1971 and opened a school there, and passed the story to a journalist named Howard Park, who was writing a piece on the Bay Area martial arts community for a regional magazine that ceased publication the following year. Park's notes survived in a filing cabinet in his apartment in Berkeley until his daughter donated them to a university archive in 2009. Gerald Fong wrote about the incident in a private letter to a colleague in Los Angeles in December of 1964. The letter described what he had seen in terms that were careful and specific, and that stopped short of identifying the man in the gray cardigan by name, referring to him only as the bookseller. His colleague kept the letter. When Fong died in 1998, the colleague spoke at his memorial and mentioned the letter and the story it contained, and described the bookseller as a person of unusual economy of movement, which was the phrase Fong had used. The phrase found its way into a small oral tradition among people who had trained in the Chinatown district in the 1960s and who had connections to that particular community. It was passed from school to school, gaining details in some tellings and losing them in others, as all such stories do, the accurate parts and the embellished parts achieving a kind of equilibrium over time in which the true core remained identifiable if you knew how to look. Patricia Sung wrote about it in a memoir published privately in 2001 and distributed among family and former students. In it, she said that what she remembered most was not the movement, which she acknowledged she had not fully seen, but the stillness at the end of it, the hand held 1 inch from the temple, the restraint of it, the decision it represented, the fact that what could have ended the encounter violently had instead been converted into a question about what the encounter was for. She wrote that she had thought about that decision many times in the decades since. She wrote that the man in the gray cardigan could have answered the question the man in the white training jacket had posed by posing a different one. He had chosen instead to answer it plainly and then immediately take the answer back, to offer a hand instead of a conclusion. She wrote that this was the most sophisticated thing she had seen one person do to another in the context of conflict, and that she had not seen it matched since. A man who walks into a room believing he is the most dangerous person in it is carrying a weight he does not feel yet. The weight is the cost of being wrong. When the bill arrives, the question is not whether he was wrong. The question is what he does with the information. Whether he folds it into himself and lets it change him, or whether he finds a way to make the information about something else, something external, something that preserves the story he was already telling. Both responses are human. Only one of them is useful. The man in the white training jacket made his choice on that street in November of 1964, and it was the harder choice, and he made it with 11 people watching, and that is worth something. That is worth a great deal, actually, when you consider what was available to him in the other direction. There is a specific kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired through study or instruction or reputation. It can only be acquired through contact. Not the contact of competition, where the rules define the edges of what is possible, but the contact of genuine encounter, where there are no edges, and the only thing standing between a man and the full extent of what another man can do is the other man's choice. The man in the gray cardigan had spent years developing the ability to close that distance, and had spent equal years developing the willingness not to complete what the distance, once closed, made possible. Both abilities mattered. The second one mattered more. The bookshop on the street behind Grant Avenue closed in 1967 when its owner moved back to Los Angeles and then to Hong Kong. The sign he had painted himself, with the English on one side and the traditional characters on the other, was taken down by the new tenants and placed in a storage room behind the rear counter, where it remained for years. A contractor working on a renovation in 1983 found it behind a false wall that had been built sometime in the intervening decade. He recognized neither the name of the shop nor the phrase it was translating. He kept the sign. He did not know why. He said later that there was something about the way it had been made that made him feel it should be kept. What a man can do and what a man will do are two different inventories. A man may spend a lifetime expanding the first list and never once examine the second. The ones who examine both, who understand that the ability to cause harm is only valuable in proportion to the wisdom not to cause it unnecessarily, those men are rarer than the ability itself. They are rarer than speed or strength or any technical refinement. And when you encounter one of them, even briefly, even as a stranger on a narrow street on a November afternoon, the encounter stays with you in a way that formal instruction does not, because it teaches you something that cannot be written in a curriculum. It teaches you the shape of the gap between what you thought was possible and what actually is. Next time, we will talk about the day a stunt coordinator on a Hollywood production decided that what was being demonstrated on set was not real, and said so loudly in front of 47 crew members, and what happened in the following 4 minutes that the director later said he never put in the film because no one would have believed it was not choreographed. That story begins with a name that everyone in this room will recognize, and it ends with a handshake that 3 witnesses described in almost identical language decades apart without having spoken to one another. We will see you there.